Hello and welcome to this little island amid the ocean that YouTube is. Last video we spoke of the military dictatorship and then Salazar's dictatorship. Today we dwell into Portugal's next chapter. The dream of autosufficiency the regime, and in particular Salazar, desired was far from ever being accomplished. A delayed development when compared to other European nations, rural stagnation, high levels of emigration, and a considerable industrial and urban surge could describe Portugal during the Estado Novo. The rural stagnation translated in an underdeveloped agriculture with low levels of productivity. Although it employed close to 40% of the Portuguese population, it provided less than 25% of the nation's wealth. In the north of the country, small farms focused on autoconsumption predominated, whilst in the south of the country, large properties usually managed by foremen and worked by salaried workers on precarious conditions predominated. Although the government tried to modernize the primary sector, it was met with resistance. Recognizing the industrial development was necessary, the government started by launching two plans that could promote the industry. The first plan occurred between 1953 until 1958 and prioritized the creation of infrastructures, such as electric system, communications, and public transports. The second plan started in 1959 and lasted until 1964. It was more ambitious than the predecessor, and it also had better results, as it coincided with the start of the policy of economic promotion of the colonies and with the integration of the country in the international economy. Until the 1960s, the new development model was linked to the industrial growth concentrated in the large coastal cities. As a result, a large rural exodus started as a large percentage of the population from the rural interior looked for jobs in the cities in search of better living conditions. Then, in another attempt at promoting the industry, a second phase was initiated, in which you can observe an inversion of the autarky policy of the first decades of the Estado Novo. Finally, on a third attempt or phase, a development of the private industry can be observed with the incentives given to entrepreneurs and the opening of the country to foreign investment. Despite the investments, throughout the 60s, much of the population, especially males between 18 and 29 years old, immigrated due to the poverty or to evade the military conscription. And the discriminalization of clandestine immigration only ended when the government realized it could benefit from it, as immigrants often transferred savings or remittances, which had considerable weight in public accounts. With the end of the Second World War and the growing democratization, Salazar realized the need to renew the regime's image. Thus, in an attempt to legitimize the regime and feign a democratic regime, amnesty was granted to some political prisoners, the political police was renamed PID instead of PVDE, a constitutional revision with the aim of introducing the system of election of deputies by constituencies instead of a single national constituency was done, and freedom of press was proclaimed. The National Assembly was dissolved with new elections being called, and the opposition was invited to participate in the elections. However, nothing had truly changed. Opposition parties were not given time nor the necessary conditions to prepare. The electoral rolls were not updated, and therefore deceased people continued to vote. The election campaigns that were carried out were done under close surveillance by the political police, and ultimately, the results were manipulated. The supposed political opening in truth only made those who opposed the regime more visible, leading to the intensification of persecution, imprisonment, and dismissal from public jobs, with many sent to exile. When it became clear that Salazar was not seriously committed to opening the regime to democracy, the opposition began the process of organizing against the regime. Thus, in October 1945, the Democratic Unity Movement, or MUD, was born. The goal of the movement was to denounce the regime abuses and demand for free and fair elections. Their actions had great impact on the public opinion, who, despite the repression, adhered to the movement throughout the country, creating a democratic opposition to the regime. In 1949, General Norton de Matos was presented as the opposition candidate in the elections for the presidency of the Republic. However, despite managing to unite the various opposition tendencies, he was forced to withdraw from the electoral process due to the intensification of repression and the inevitable defeat due to the rigged election. Nonetheless, some damage to the regime's grasp had been done, as the strong popular mobilization around his candidacy and the enthusiasm it aroused in public opinion paved the way in which Humberto Delgado would 9 years later come to truly startle the regime. In 1958, General Humberto Delgado was one of the candidates for the presidency of the Republic, and the one who publicly stated his intention to dismiss Salazar if elected. As Delgado took his candidacy to the polls, he enthusiastically appealed to all voters to show up and unmask the constitutional illegalities with their votes. When the election results showed yet another major victory for the regime's candidate, Américo Tomás, the credibility that the regime had was undoubtedly shaken. Salazar realized it was becoming more difficult to deceive the public opinion and to respond to the pressures from the international community. Thus, he introduced an amendment to the constitution in which the election of the President of the Republic would be carried out by a restricted electoral college instead of by direct suffrage. Stricken by illness, Salazar was indirectly removed from office in 1968. His successor would be Marcelo Caetano, who seemed at first keen to reconcile the political interests of the conservative sectors with the growing demands for democratization of the regime. This position led to the so-called Marcelist Spring, in which, among other actions, led to some decompression, the police repression and censorship, permission was given to some political exiles to return, and in an attempt to improve its image, the repressive police of the regime had its name once again changed, this time from PIDE to DGS. The National Union was renamed to Popular National Action, or ANP, and had young generations adhering to the liberalization of the regime. For the 1969 elections, all literate women were granted the right to vote, non-communist political movements were legalized, and could consult the electoral rolls and inspect the polling stations. However, Marcelo Caetano quickly showed signs of favoring the continuity of the regime. Still in 1969, the student protest movement broke out at the universities of Lisbon and Coimbra, which extended to the labor sector, leading to the regime to consider it had gone too far in their liberalization attempts. The government quickly launched a violent attack on the electoral movements such as the CDE, the Democratic Electoral Commission, and the CEUD, the Electoral Commission of Democratic Union. As such, the elections constituted yet another fraud. The police repression was intensified and arrests increased from 1970 onwards. The intensification of the student protests led to the closing of student associations, and universities were invaded by the police. In 1972, Américo Tomás was once again elected President of the Republic without popular suffrage. Regarding the colonies, the honorary title of state was granted to Angola and Mozambique, which were endowed with their own governments, assemblies, and courts, although still dependent on Lisbon. However, even though enshrined in the constitution in 1972, little to nothing changed, and thus the war with the colonies continued and Portugal's isolation increased. Movements of opposition to the colonial war that had started in 1961 grew in the student strata, and escapees from the military incorporation accentuated. Progressive Catholic groups publicly condemned the ongoing war and manifested their recognition of the right of African peoples to self-determination. At the end of 1973, deputies from the most liberal wing of the National Assembly also protested against the war. And in the early 1974, in the face of obvious defeat, it was the high military hierarchy that denounced the failure of the military solution. Faced with the continuation of the colonial war, and the government's refusal to seek a political solution, the dissatisfaction of the business sector eager to get closer to the European community, an intensification of violence carried out by armed clandestine movements, and growing popular discontentment against the rising cost of living, the regime would start to crack. From 1973 onwards, a clandestine movement of soldiers, mostly captains, began to organize a coup d'état that would put an end to the regime and create a favorable condition for a political resolution of the colonial question. It was a movement made up of permanent staff officers, initially protesting against the military integration of militia officers, and after their successful claim, they realized the political power they had. Thus, the political solution to the war problem became the main objective of future meetings of the movement of captains. Faced with the regime's obstinacy in relation to maintaining the war, the High Command of the General Staff refused to participate in a manifestation of support for the government and its policy, which resulted in the dismissal of Gomes da Costa, the chief, and António de Spínola, the deputy chief, leading both to gather the trust of the protest movement that was growing in the military. Thus, led by General Gomes da Costa and Spínola, the original corporate movement of the captains grew with the addition of the main military units. It thus evolved into the Armed Forces Movement, MFA. On April 24, 1974, coordinated by Major Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, at 10:55 p.m., the first signal was given to the adhering units to begin preparations for the military operations to be launched by the Armed Forces Movement. Around 11 p.m., at a practical artillery school, the commander and second commander of the unit were arrested, as well as the non-compliant sergeants. The radio and TV sites were occupied. From this point on, an array of actions would take place involving all sectors of the military forces throughout the entire country. These are only a few key actions. April 25th, 1974, 12:20 a.m. Rádio Renascença broadcasts Grândola Vila Morena, signaling the military units that they could advance and occupy the sites considered strategic, such as radio and RTP stations, military and civilian airports, and the main institutions of political military leadership. At 3:16 a.m., the MFA command post manages to intercept a call between the Minister of Defense and the Minister of the Army and learned that until that moment, the regime was not aware of the ongoing operations. At 3:30 a.m., the Cavalry Practice School of Santarém, EPC, leaves towards Lisbon under the command of Captain Salgueiro Maia, with the aim of establishing itself in Lisbon and controlling the accesses to Banco de Portugal, Companhia Portuguesa Rádio Marconi, and Terreiro do Paço. The column consisted of a reconnaissance squadron of 10 armored vehicles, a reconnaissance squadron of 160 men, with 12 transport vehicles, 2 ambulances, and 1 jeep. At the same time, the commander of the Porto Public Security Policy, or PSP, Colonel Santos Jr., learns about the occupation of the North Military Region headquarters and communicates immediately with the command of the National Republican Guard, the GNR. At 3:45 a.m., the Battalion No. 4 of the GNR in Porto goes into strict prevention. The commands of the PSP in Porto and the Cavalry Battalion No. 6 Porto are contacted and instructed to take forceful action against the headquarters of the Northern Military Region in power of the MFA. The commander and second commander of the RC6, Lieutenant Colonel Arriscado Nunes and Martins Rodrigues, refused the orders and joined the movement. At 4:25 a.m., the MFA command post is informed that the main objectives were taken or under control. With the occupation of Lisbon's airport, the order for Rádio Clube Português to broadcast the first communiqué was given. At 4:26 a.m., Rádio Clube Português broadcasts the first communiqué in which the population is asked to remain calm and medical personnel is told to go to the hospitals to aid if necessary. At 5 a.m., Silva Pais, director of PIDE or DGS, calls the president of the council, Marcelo Caetano, to inform him of the ongoing revolution that was in the streets, and that the rebels had already occupied the main radio and television stations and had taken over the headquarters of the military region of Lisbon. Shortly afterwards, Silva Pais recommended Marcelo Caetano to go to the Carmo barracks. At the same time, the Cavalry Regiment 7, under the regime's command, prepares its tanks to leave. At 5:45 a.m., for the first time, notices are broadcasted addressing explicitly the National Republican Guard, the Public Security Police, the General Directorate of Security, and the Portuguese Legion. At 6 a.m., the column from the Practical School of Cavalry arrives at Terreiro do Paço. Upon entering it, a PSP device surrounding the area was already there. Without interfering with the action, they collaborate in keeping civilians off the area. Captain Salgueiro Maia informs the MFA command post that they had occupied Terreiro do Paço, Banco de Portugal, and Rádio Marconi. At that same moment, the president of the council, accompanied by the military assistant Commander Coutinho Lanhoso, enters the GNR barracks in Largo do Carmo, where they are received by the General Commander of the GNR, General Adriano Pires. The second commander of RML, Brigadeiro Junqueira dos Reis, is called to command the government forces and counter-attack positions are taken. At 6:30 a.m., Captain Salgueiro Maia asked the MFA command post to send a superior officer to arrest the Minister of the Army. At 6:45 a.m., the Major Otelo appoints Lieutenant Colonel Correia de Campos to arrest the Minister of the Army. At the same moment, the counter-offensive was launched with the regime command post in Lanceiros II. A force of 5 M47 tanks and Panhard machine guns left Ajuda towards Terreiro do Passo. At 7 a.m., a force of Panhard machine guns commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ferrante de Almeida faced Captain Salgueiro Maia force. With the ultimatum of surrendering or firing, the Lieutenant Colonel surrenders under the windows of the Ministry of the Army. At 7:30 a.m., the GNR column that was parked in Campo das Cebolas moves towards Terreiro do Passo. Faced with Captain Salgueiro Maia, and without the potential to fight, the column commander obeys and withdraws. At that very moment, the graduating frigate that was part of a NATO force and was sailing towards the southern bar of the port of Lisbon, bound for Naples, received an order from the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Navy, Admiral Jaime Lopes, to abandon the graduation and stand in front of Terreiro do Passo, at the command of the General Staff of the Navy. At 7:50 a.m., Jaime Lopes orders the ship's commander to open fire on the army tanks positioned in Terreiro do Passo. The commander of the unit does not comply with the order, claiming that there were a lot of people in Terreiro do Passo, as well as several castilheiros nearby. At 2:30 p.m., through radio, the MFA command post contacts Captain Salgueiro Maia, informing the GNR is trying to gain time and that it is vital to force them to surrender, as the arrest of the head of the government would demobilize government force. Thus, the indication is given to force gates of the GNR, either by the back of an armored vehicle or by machine gun bursts. At 3:10 p.m., Salgueiro Maia, using a megaphone, sets the deadline of 10 minutes for the surrender of the Carmo barracks, after which he will open fire. At 3:25 p.m., failing to surrender within the deadline set, Captain Salgueiro Maia gives order to Lieutenant Santos Silva to open fire to the upper front part of the barracks, with the machine guns in the tower of his Chaimite. Several bursts are fired, shattering windows on the front of the building. At 4 p.m., Salgueiro Maia orders the placement of an armored vehicle in a firing position. The engine starts, while the population around the building seeks shelter. Salgueiro Maia starts the countdown, but before finishing it, Dr. Pedro Feitor Pinto, Director of Information Services, and Dr. Nuno Távora, Secretary of Dr. Pedro Pinto, Secretary of State for Information and Tourism, approach him holding a credential from General Spínola intent to dialogue with Marcelo Caetano. Both are authorized to enter the barracks. At 4:45 p.m., General António Spínola calls the MFA command post and speaks with Major Otelo. He asks to be mandated to receive Marcelo Caetano. Spínola is thus mandated by the MFA command post to accept Marcelo Caetano's surrender. Spínola is also informed that the regime's leaders will be taken to Funchal by an Air Force T-6. At 6 p.m., General Spínola arrives at the Carmo barracks and is greeted by Salgueiro Maia. Spínola speaks with Marcelo Caetano, informing him that he will travel by military plane to Funchal. At 8:30, General António Spínola arrives at the MFA command post. With him are the arrested members of the government. At that exact time, the people of Lisbon who had been following the military movement since morning began to increase in the streets of Baixa as the forces of the movement were conquering objectives. The population began to flock massively to the PIDE and DGS headquarters on Rua António Maria Cardoso. At 9 p.m., upon seeing the headquarters surrounded by the mob of civilians, PIDE-DGS agents opened indiscriminate fire, causing 4 deaths and 45 wounded. At that same moment, upon hearing the shots, Captain Andrade Moura from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, who was stationed in Largo do Carmo, heard the shots and is informed by people of what was happening at the PIDE headquarters. He then proceeds to move an armored car and some jeeps with RC3 and RE1 personnel to the site. With enormous difficulty, he managed to approach and set up a siege at a distance to the PIDE headquarters. He does not, however, have enough personnel to attempt any breakthrough. At 9:15 p.m., the MFA command post is informed of what is happening on Rua António Maria Cardoso. At 9:30, Major Otelo asks General Spínola to convince the former Minister of the Interior, César Moreira Batista, who was imprisoned within the unit, to convince the director of PIDE, Silva Paz, to surrender. The call is made and Silva Paz is willing to surrender, if the armed forces guarantee protection to the agents. At 10 p.m., Almada Contreras, who was connecting the Navy to the MFA command post, informs Costa Correia that the PIDE-DGS headquarters were resisting and that they had opened fire on the population, so it would be necessary to isolate the area and obtain its surrender. Costa Correia orders the force to prepare, asking Contreras to notify other forces at the location of their deployments. At 11 p.m., the meeting between the National Salvation Board and officials who were linked to the writing of the MFA program begins. Spínola's personal power project emerges and the first of many clashes between General Spínola and the MFA takes place. Spínola claims that it is necessary to review the MFA program that he had previously accepted, and the impasse only broke when Captain Lieutenant Victor Crespo reminds him that the armored vehicles and troops were still on the street, and that if necessary, the coup could continue. At 11:45, the National Board of Salvation meets and approves the proclamation of the board and designates General António de Spínola as President of the Republic. This designation was contrary to what was previously agreed with the MFA, which had chosen General Gomes Costa. Legislation concerning the destitution of the deposed regime and legitimization of the new revolutionary power was published. Law No. 174 dismissed the President of the Republic and the government from their functions, dissolved the National Assembly and the Council of State, and determined that all the powers attributed to those bodies should be exercised by the National Board of Salvation. Decree of Law No. 169/74 exonerates the Governors-General of the States of Angola and Mozambique and determined that their functions would be carried out on an interim basis by the Secretaries-Generals of those states. Decree of Law No. 171/74 extinguished the Directorate-General for Security, the Legião Portuguesa and Mocidade Portuguesa. Decree Law 172/74 dissolved the Popular National Action, and Decree of Law No. 179/74 exonerated the civil governors of the mainland and islands. On April 26th, at 3 a.m., not knowing the intentions within the PIDE-DGS, Costa Correia decided, in contact with Contreras, to wait for daybreak and try to calm the spirits of the people who were in the vicinity. It was also decided to use one of the captured PIDE agents to act as a mediator between the force and the PIDE-DGS Directorate. At 7 a.m., Admiral Américo Tomás, under the escort of a force from the movement, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Almeida Bruno, heads to the Lisbon airport. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Lopes Pires takes Marcelo Caetano and former Minister Silva Cunha and Moreira Batista to the airport, where they all boarded an Air Force plane to Funchal, where they will stay with guarded residence. At 8:30 a.m., the PIDE-DGS agent acting as an intermediary goes to Costa Correia, informing that Director of PIDE-DGS, Major Silva Paz, had all the personnel available to the command of the Navy Force. At 9 a.m., April 26, 1974, the PIDE-DGS had surrendered. Despite the appeal, the streets of Lisbon flooded with civilians throughout the day that joined the military. At one point, a flower seller began handing out carnations. The soldiers stuck the flower in the muzzles of their rifles and the civilians on their chests, thus baptizing it the Carnation Revolution. The song Grândola Vila Morena, that signaled to the military units that they could advance, also became a symbol of the revolution. Although a peaceful revolution, 4 civilians died on April 25th at the hands of PIDEs: Fernando dos Reis, Fernando Gesteiro, João Arruda, and José Barneto. The youngest was 18 years old. The oldest was 37 years old. With the end of the resistance of the Cavalry Regiment 7 and the peaceful surrendering of Marcelo Caetano, who handed power to General Spínola, the siege to GNR headquarters in Carmo ended, and by the end of April 25, 1974, the operation and regime was considered successful. Thus, today, April 25, 2023, marks the 49th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution, which ended the dictatorship in Portugal that lasted in total 48 years. With all its flaws, we celebrate democracy, with which without it, I wouldn't be here, or at least, Portugal would possibly be a very different country. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay safe.
Aqui posto de comando do movimento das Forças Armadas. As Forças Armadas Portuguesas apelam para todos os habitantes da cidade de Lisboa no sentido de recolherem as suas casas, nas quais se devem conservar com a máxima calma. Esperamos sinceramente que a gravidade da hora que vivemos não seja tristemente assinalada por qualquer acidente pessoal, para o que apelamos para o bom senso dos comandos das forças militarizadas, no sentido de serem evitados quais